As we discussed in the last video, we have our socket join listener, but the problem is that the information inside of here, it gets lost once the callback is complete. Things like the user's name and the room name, they are not persisted anywhere. We're going to need that information to complete our event listeners down below. Create message is going to need to know the user's name as well as the room name to send that message to the specific room. Same thing with create location message. Now, we don't have access to the data that is inside of join up above, but we do have access to one common thing, and that is the socket ID. We have access to the socket variable right here, socket.id, and we also have access to it down below inside of our other event listeners. And this is going to be what we use inside of a data structure we're about to create. We're going to create an array of users where we can store this information. When we want to look up a user, like we might want to do down below, we'll simply pass in the ID to some function. We'll get back the name and the room name, and we can emit the event as we want. Now, in order to get that done, we are going to make a brand new file in utils. We're going to call this file users.js, and this is where we're going to store everything related to that user's data structure. And it's going to be nothing more than an array. It's going to be an array like this. It'll be an array of objects, and on each object, we're going to have the ID, which will be the socket ID, some sort of really long string like this. We'll also have our name. This is the display name for the user. Mine might be Andrew. And finally, the room the user joined. This could be something like the office fans. This is all the information we need to store in our data structure for a user to be able to wire everything up. Now, the real work is going to come inside of the methods that we'll be creating to manipulate this array. We're going to have 4. We want to be able to add a user via an add user method. This is going to take 3 pieces of information, the ID, the name, and the room name. We're also going to want to have a method for removing a user when they leave a room. Remember, we want to update that people list in the left-hand sidebar. If I go to localhost 3000, right here, when someone leaves, we want to update the people list, removing them from the list, which means we're going to need a way to remove them as well as add them. Remove user, and we're going to be removing users by the socket ID. Next up, we're going to have a way to fetch a user. This is going to come in handy when we're trying to send a message like we do inside of the create message listener. Right here, we're going to want access to the user's name as well as the room in order to fire off the new message event. That is going to happen via a get user method, which is going to take an ID and it'll return the object up above. The last one we're going to be adding is get user list. Get user list. Get user list is going to take the room name. It is going to figure out exactly which users are in that room, and it's going to return an array of names, and we'll print those names to the client. These 4 methods are all we need to get this done. Now, there's a couple ways we could do this. We could do something like this. We might make an array called users, setting it equal to an empty array, and then we might define our functions. You don't have to write this out. I'm going to be deleting this in a moment. Var add user, and we'll set that equal to a function that takes ID, name, and room. Then inside the function, we'll do something like manipulate this array with users.push, pushing on some object. Then we'll export it using modules .export, exporting the add user function as the add user property, and then we would call add user over in server.js. Now, I know I went fast there, and that's because we're not going to be using this approach. This approach works fine. We have a users array, and we can manipulate the array. It does get the job done, but what we're going to do instead is use the ES6 class syntax. This is going to let us create a users class. We'll be able to make a new instance of that class and fire all of our methods, which we'll be defining up above. I'm going to do this as opposed to creating ad hoc functions that all work with one piece of information right here. Now, to get this done, we are going to have to learn something new. We're going to be learning about ES6 classes. In order to talk about those, let's go ahead and simply create one right here. Now, the syntax for creating a new class is going to look a little strange at first. It is unique to what we're about to do, but I promise that once you make 1 or 2 classes and add a few methods, you'll get really used to defining the methods and the classes themselves. To kick things off, we're going to create a simple class for a person. This means that we're making a set of data and a set of methods that are useful for manipulating the person. Now, in order to get started, we are going to use the class keyword followed by the class name. We're going to use an uppercase first letter for our class definition since we are going to be creating new instances of them with the new keyword. You do not need to use an uppercase P. This is just common convention across JavaScript. If a function is meant to be used with new, like new person, new object, or new anything else, it should have an uppercase first letter. This is just a styling convention. Now, right after our name, we can simply open and close some curly braces, and there we have it. We have a brand new class, and we can even make an instance of it. We can make a variable called me and set it equal to new uppercase P person, calling it as a function just like this. Now we have a new instance of the class and we can do whatever we like with it. Currently, it doesn't do anything, but we do have an instance created. Now, one of the first things about a class that's really great is the ability to add a constructor function. A constructor function is a special function. It is specific to the class. It automatically fires and it lets you initialize the instance of your class. In this case, we want to do something to customize an individual person when a new person is created. To define a constructor function, we start with a name, constructor, but instead of adding a colon or anything else, we simply go right to our function arguments and right into the curly braces. This is our function. It's just like a regular function. The code inside is going to get executed, and these are our arguments, but the syntax for setting it up does look pretty different than what we would do on an object or on anything else. Now, this constructor function, it gets called by default. You do not need to manually call it. And that actually gets called with the arguments that you specify right here, which means that we could have our person constructor function take 2 arguments. Maybe we want to initialize a new person with a name and an age. That means we would pass in name and age right here. I can say that name is a string. I'm going to set it as my name, and age is a number like 25. The constructor function is now going to get called with this data, and we can prove this by using console.log to print out the name and as the second argument, the age. Now let's go ahead and run this file and see what we get. It's sitting in server utils. I'm going to shut down nodemon and run it. Clear node server /utils/users.js. When I run the file, what do we get? We get Andrew 25 because the arguments were properly passed into the constructor. Now, passing data in really isn't useful. What we want to do is modify the specific instance. We want to set this person's name and age, not the name and age for all people. In order to do that, we're going to use the this keyword. In class methods and in the constructor function, this refers to the instance as opposed to the class, which means right here, we can set a property on this individual person. This.name equals name, just like this. And we can do the exact same thing for age. This.age equals the age. Using this is how we customize the individual instance. Now what we have is an object, and we can actually access those properties down below. The me variable right here, it is identical to the this variable as defined up above, which means that we can actually access those properties. Console.log. I'm going to print the string this.name for formatting only. Then I'm going to reference the actual me.name property. And we can do the exact same thing for age. We're going to print what we had put in as this.age, only we're going to access it via me.age. We can now rerun the file using nodemon server /utils/users.js. And what do we get? We get exactly what we'd expect. The individual person was updated. This.name was set to Andrew, and it is indeed showing that down below. Now that we have a basic idea as to how we can initialize a class, let's go ahead and talk about methods. Methods can be any function. They could take arguments, maybe they don't take arguments, and to define them, all we do is the following. Without adding a comma, another quirk of the class syntax, we specify our method name. I'm going to create one called getUserDescription. This one is not going to take any arguments, so we can leave that arguments list empty. Down below, inside of the function itself, we're going to go ahead and return a description, since the method, after all, is called getUserDescription. We're going to return a template string, injecting some values inside of there. The general flow is going to be gen is 1 year inside of parentheses s, years old. This is what we want to print, but we want to use those specific values for this individual person. And to do that, we're going to access those properties once again. Instead of a static name, we're going to inject this dot name. And instead of a static age, we're going to inject the age, this dot age. Now we can go ahead and actually test out get user description by calling it down below. We can make a variable called description. We can set it equal to me.get user description. And we can go ahead and do something with the return value, like print it to the screen using console.log. Inside of the log argument list, I'm just going to pass in description. Now we can save the file, and we should see over inside of the terminal our description. In this case, Andrew and 25. Andrew is 25 years old. When I save the file, NodeMon is going to restart, and right here we get just that. Andrew is 25 years old, prints to the screen. This is the very basics of classes. There's a ton of class-related features we won't be exploring just yet, but for now, this gives us everything we need in order to get started. Instead of a person class, we're going to create a users class, and instead of methods like getUserDescription, we're going to create methods like the ones we have here. We're also going to be adding test cases as we go to make sure they work as expected. In this video, we're going to get started adding the users class, and in the next one, we'll finish it up adding all of the methods. For now, though, we can start defining it. I am going to comment out the person class down below, since we do want it in place as documentation, but we're not going to exactly use it inside of the app. We'll delete it a bit later once we're more comfortable with classes. Now, right here, we're going to start by creating our users class using the class keyword, class users, just like this. We're then going to go ahead and open up and close our curly braces, and inside of here we can specify any methods we like, such as the constructor function. We are going to define a constructor function, although they are completely optional when creating classes. Right here, we're going to set up our constructor function by name, then we'll have our arguments list followed by the opening and closing curly braces. Now, the constructor function for users, unlike person, is not going to take any arguments. When we make a new users instance, we just want to start with an empty array of users. We're going to be making this new instance over inside of server.js when we first start the app. That is going to happen up top, and down below we'll actually be using the methods when someone joins a room, leaves a room, or manipulates a room in whatever way they want. That means that right here, all we need to do is set this .users, the users property, equal to an empty array. And this is going to be the array we've defined right here. The next thing we're going to do, now that we have our constructor function in place, is create the add user method. We're going to create that right here by defining it like we did for get user description. Add user, just like this. We're going to set up the arguments list. This one is going to take some arguments. We'll specify those in a moment. And we're going to open and close our curly braces for the actual function code. The 3 arguments we're going to require is ID, name, and room. In order to add a user to the users array, we need those 3 pieces of information. Once we have them, actually adding them to the list is going to be really easy. I'm going to get started by creating a variable user so we can make an object to push onto the array. Right here, we'll set an ID property equal to the ID argument, and we'll do the same thing for name and finally for room. Now we have a user object with those 3 properties, and we can go ahead and push it on the array. This dot users dot push to add an object onto the end, and the thing we're going to be adding onto our array is the user variable. Now that we have this in place, we are basically done. The last thing I'm going to do is go ahead and return the successfully created user, just like this. And there we go. Add user is complete. We're not going to wire it up just yet, but we can add a test case for add user. We'll do that over inside of a brand new file called, you guessed it, users.test.js. In here, we'll be able to load in users, test it, and do whatever else we might need to do. Now, the first step is going to be to actually export users. Currently, we define the class, but we do not export it. Exporting it is going to be the same as exporting anything else. There's nothing special there. Module dot exports, and we're going to go ahead and export inside of curly braces an object where the user's property equals the user's class definition we have above, making sure to match the case. Now that we have this in place, we can actually require our class and make new instances of it over inside of the test file. Let's get started by loading an expect. Const expect equals require expect. And we can also go ahead and load in our users file. Const, using ES6 destructuring, we're going to grab users, and we're going to get that via the local file /users. Awesome. Now, for the moment, we're just going to add a test case for adding a user. We'll make a quick describe block. Most of the heavy lifting is going to happen in the next video. Right here, we'll describe our user's class. We can then add our arrow function, and we can go ahead and add a test case. It, inside of quotes, should add new user. I'm going to go ahead and set up the function for this one. It's going to be a synchronous function, so there's no need for the done argument. And we can create a new instance of users. Var users with a lowercase u equals a new users right here. Now, since we don't take any arguments in the constructor function, we're not going to pass any in when we actually create our instance. The next thing we're going to do is make a user, then we'll be passing its properties to add user, making sure the appropriate thing shows up in the end. Let's go ahead and make a variable user right here, and we'll set that equal to an object. I'm going to go ahead and set on this object 3 properties, an ID equal to something like 123, a name property equal to some name like Andrew. You can go ahead and use your first name, and a room name. I'm going to use the office fans. Perfect. Now we have the user in place, and we can go ahead and call that method that we just created, the add user method with the 3 necessary arguments, ID, name, and room. I'm going to store the response in a variable called response user, and we'll set it equal to users.add user, passing in those 3 pieces of information, user.id, user.name, and as the third argument, user.room. With the call in place, we can now start making our assertions. One assertion we want to make is that the actual users array was updated. It should have been updated when we called this.users.push. I'm going to expect that by calling expect. We're going to expect something about users.users. Sorry for the double users there. The first user refers to this variable, and the second one actually accesses the users array as defined right here. And then we're going to call it to equal. Remember, for arrays and objects, you have to use to equal as opposed to be. We're going to expect it to be an array with just one item. The item should look just like the user object we have above. If this passes, then we know our user was indeed added to the users array. I'm going to go ahead and save the file and shut down node mon. I'm going to clear the terminal output and run npm test to make sure our brand new test case is passing, and when I run it, it does indeed pass. Right here we have our users block, and should add new user is working as expected. With this in place, we are ready to move on to part 2, where we actually finish the methods as well as the tests. Then we can integrate it into our application. As a quick recap, in this one, we looked at how we can create classes in ES6 using the class keyword. We made a person class, which was just an example, and we made our users class, which we'll actually be using throughout the course. We looked at adding custom methods as well as setting up our constructor function. As I just mentioned, we'll be continuing with this in the next one, part 2, so stay tuned. I'll see you then.